So when Agnès Benassi, the president of the French Economics Association, asked me to organize this session on refugees, I thought it's a good idea to try to show different facets of economics research on refugees. And I think the title is really what I had in mind. What can we as economists contribute to refugee integration? And I think we can contribute things that come from different subfields in economics. We will start with theory with Alex Teytelboym, who is a market designer, who is doing matching in theory and trying to do in practice. The theory is easier because you don't need to convince policymakers to do theory, but the practice is an optimistic person, so I'm sure he will manage to do that as well. Then we will have two empirical presentations. Thank you. First, Francesco Fasani from, I forgot to say, Alex is from Oxford University. We have another person who crossed the channel, but he's not British, Italian, from Queen Mary University, Francesco Fasani. He will use standard empirical analysis to do a comparative empirical analysis of refugee integration and policies of integration in different European countries. And then we will have Matti Sarvimaaki from the University of Helsinki, who is leading a large-scale experiment on refugee integration. So at this stage, it will be, I think, more about the design because it's very early stages. But hopefully he will come to give a seminar next year with the full set of results. But here he can report already on the design and maybe also on preliminary results. Okay, so we'll have one theoretical presentation, one empirical standard observational data, and then experimental approach. Okay.
Hillel, thank you so much for including me in this panel. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should say this work started out sort of conceptually with a refugee studies scholar, Will Jones, who you see over there, and that was actually just conceptualizing some of the ideas that are in here. After that, we wrote a theory paper. Actually, it was kind of a traditional mechanism design paper with David Delacroix and Scott Commoners. And then the last bit of the project, which I'm sort of delighted to report because it's only 2 weeks old, it's actually putting this stuff into practice, or not quite this stuff into practice, because the practice tends to be much more complicated than the theory. And this is being done with Andy Trapp, Nargis Ahani, and Tommy Anderson. So let me set the scene. It's kind of nice to be the first speaker because I can give you some numbers and set the stage for all of this stuff, and then the future speakers can hopefully skip this and have more time. So what numbers are we talking about? There are sort of just over 65 million people who've been forcibly displaced, most of them within their own countries. And so the people that we are going to talk about today are about 16 million or so people who have had to cross an international border, and the UNHCR therefore considers them to be refugees under the UNHCR mandate. Now, my particular interest is actually in a very small sliver of the refugees, of the total refugee population, which are refugees who are in need of resettlement. So I'll be a bit more precise about what that means, but the shorthand to think about this is that even by the standards of refugees, refugees who are in need of resettlement are particularly vulnerable. So their lot is really quite terrible. So how many refugees are in need of resettlement? Currently, just over 1 million. So that's the blue line on the top. You can see this number goes up and down. This is just what the UNHCR decides in any particular year. And so what happens to refugees who are in need of resettlement? They have the opportunity to be moved from typically some safe country, some country in which they're perhaps seeking asylum right now, into a third country, which, as you will see, is typically a country like the US, Canada, or Australia. Okay, and as you can see again from this chart, these are the two lines on the bottom. Very few refugees actually get directly resettled. So these are centralized programs, but very few refugees, only about a tenth of those who need it in any particular year actually get to be resettled. But my interest is going to be in improving the yellow and the red line. And seeing how far we can bump it up. So something like 160,000 people were resettled last year. If President Obama and another 49 heads of state had their way in September 2016, we probably would have been on track to resettling about 350,000 people. But things don't always turn out the way you plan. So who are these refugees who are in need of resettlement? So this is out of the people who have actually been resettled. So what the UNHCR does, it categorizes refugees according to the terrible things basically that have happened to them. The most common thing is legal and protection needs. One example of this might be something like you face political persecution in your country. So even if a civil war ends, you really can't go back to your country because you might continue facing this political persecution. Now, there is other categories like survival of torture, being a woman at risk, and so on. And in fact, what's particularly sad is that actually most refugees are in multiple of these categories. And then the UNHCR actually picks the kind of best category that makes it most likely that a particular country would decide to resettle them. So what happens is the UNHCR identifies a family in need, it then interviews them and so on, and then it looks for a country where this family could be resettled, and tries to convince them that this is a sort of a family that they should take. And by and large, they do a very good job. So about 90% of all the submissions that the UNHCR makes to the countries actually eventually get accepted by these countries. And so what are these countries? Actually, most resettlement destinations of the sort I've described right now, the biggest recipient of refugees is still the United States. This is data for 2016. As you can imagine, the data for 2017 is going to look somewhat different, but let's not worry. In June we will get the 2017 data, but until June we can see that it's mainly the US, and actually traditionally it has been the US. So since these programs have been set up. The other big players in this are sort of Canada, UK, and indeed France too. Okay, so where the key thing I just want to emphasize is that refugees can come from many countries. At the moment, most of them are coming obviously from Syria, from the Democratic Republic of Congo. It really depends where it's from. Now, do not think about the refugees who have walked from Syria to Germany. So these people are refugees, but they haven't been resettled. So they came and they sought asylum, and a lot of them basically qualify as refugees under international law. And so we need to have good ways of figuring out how to integrate them and how to make their lives better. This project is not about this. This project is about trying to improve those centralized resettlement schemes. Okay? So just to give you an idea of how it works in the United States, which is really the big player in this at the moment, despite what's going on, there is the Department of Homeland Security decentralizes the process to 9 resettlement agencies. So some of these are religious institutions or formerly religious institutions. Some of them are these large international charities like the International Rescue Committee, and they basically mediate matches between the refugee families and the local areas. Okay, I call them localities usually. Okay, now what's really interesting to me as a theorist is that the thing that seems to matter is the initial match. So, the place where you first resettle the refugee family seems to dramatically affect not just their own outcome, but also the outcomes of their children. We have fantastic evidence from this from Sweden and from Denmark. And in fact, we've even got recent evidence for this for the US. So employment, welfare, education, a lot of these things are actually affected by the initial match. And so what we want to do basically in this project is to improve that initial match, right? To improve that initial allocation. And the resettlement agencies are very keen on doing this. They really think about refugee welfare, from at least my interaction with them, in a very kind of holistic way, and they really worry about, making the refugees themselves happy, whatever that might mean. Now, the problem that they face is that, of course, the local areas to which they resettle refugees have to offer this capacity to resettle voluntarily. So it's not true for every country, but it's certainly true for the US, is that the resettlement agency works with the local area to make sure that year by year they're still happy to take refugees of different kinds and continue doing so in the future whenever the refugee flows change. So the central government only sets the number of how many refugees they're willing to admit. And then after that, it's up to the resettlement agency to allocate them to whatever areas they work. And 9 resettlement agencies work with different areas all around the US, as I'll show you. So one of the happy things I can report today is that 2 weeks ago, we have launched a piece of software. This is a version 0.00. And what it does is I'll show you what the model looks like. It's one picture. So it applies this model to try and figure out where to best place refugees on a very sort of shabby metric in a way. It is the probability of obtaining employment within 3 months. So this is the only data which we have. And our colleagues at Stanford, this is the paper by Bansak et al. This is a wonderful paper in Science that's just come out in January. They sort of they kind of develop a method of how to do this using advanced econometrics or machine learning, and we sort of apply these methods with the model that I'll show you to try and see where we should place refugees best. Okay, so that's the version right now. What I want to tell you about is, can we do even better than this? So if what we cared about is overall refugee welfare, not just 3 months probability of employment, which should tell you this is probably not a great metric. If we cared about refugees' preferences, how would we set up a system like this? Okay, so refugees get placed everywhere. In this year, everywhere except for the state of Wyoming, but most of them go to big populated states like Texas, California, New York State, and Florida. And so we want to get this initial match right, but just to give you an idea, they're not really concentrated around the US. So why is this interesting to a theorist? Okay, why is this interesting to a sort of a matching theorist? What you're dealing with is a problem of matching families. So kind of most families that are resettled, they're quite large. In the UK, for example, the median family size was 6 for the resettlement program. So there's now it's actually also is the maximum size of the family that the UK was admitting. So you can see that there might be some incentive compatibility constraints. We're not being satisfied somewhere, but nevertheless, families tend to be quite big, and this will matter. And what happens is a family, because it has many members, many different family members of different ages and different needs, they have needs for different types of services, right? And so it might be language services or employment support, or it might be that a family only has a single adult, so they need help with looking after the kids while they go to work. Or there might be disabled elderly family members and so on. Or it might be sort of some more obvious things, like they need very specialist medical treatment, okay? And the constraint that one faces as a designer is that there are no there's no real possibility of transfer. So typically what the government does, I think this is true everywhere I've studied, the government gives a sort of a lump sum that's a function of how many adults and how many children there are. And then the family just takes that money or the local area gets that money to be able to resettle a refugee. What one can't do, as much as one might want to, if this is what you had in mind, is that you can't sort of just take the refugees and auction them off in a sort of very complicated combinatorial auction. But you just can't do this because that's just, perhaps that would be unethical, but it's also just not possible at the moment. And the interesting thing is that this is a very thin market. So sort of if you actually look at any given month of how many refugees are resettled and how many areas there are, we're talking about small integer number of families. So again, what you can't do is to sort of say, this is a large market, there are not a lot of constraints in here, let's sort of imagine that a family is relatively small given what constraints they face. That doesn't seem to be true in practice. So we need to develop a theory that can take these things into account. So if I have no possibility of transfers and to make sure that we can handle these thin and heterogeneous thinness and heterogeneity. Okay? Good. So what is it related to? So in case you want to work on this, the papers to read really are papers on two-sided matching market design. It's, Al Roth recently won the Nobel Prize, so this field I think has a lot of prominence now, which is great. And there's a ton of great applications of this kind of theory across things like matching resident doctors to hospitals or kids to schools and so on. But more recently, and in fact, I think Hillel really kind of kicked this off with his paper in Journal of Public Economics, is the idea of using matching theory in the refugee resettlement context. And Hillel's idea was to use this in an international context, is to say, you know, if how would one allocate refugees across countries? And in that world, you really can think of a family as being quite small, right, relative to the size of a country. Now, other folks, Tommy Anderson in particular, they've thought about how do you allocate refugees to housing. That's another problem. But our focus was, with Will Jones originally, is to think how do you allocate a refugee to a local area. And this is where the sort of, you will see the model will sort of convey this. Okay. And if you're really interested in this, I should tell you there's a ton of cool matching theory literature that's related to this model. But, you know, if you haven't, never mind. But it's kind of in a space of complex or messy matching market design, okay, including things like matching with minimum quotas and so on. Okay, so let me just tell you what the model is. The particular pleasure of doing this theoretical model is that it can be summarized in a picture like this. Okay, that's the model. So let me describe to you what the model actually says. Here we have 5 families and we have 2 services, right? Maybe this is the number of language training places on the left and the number of like school places that a family needs on the right. Okay, this is completely arbitrary. And so family 1 needs 1 service left and 0 services right, and family 2 needs 2 services left and 1 service right, and so on and so forth, right? Is that clear? So this is the yellow family 2, and then the green family doesn't need any left service and it needs only the 2 units of the right service, right? Now, the localities, these are the boxes at the bottom. They're supplying these services, right? So locality 1 supplies 4 units of service left. It has 4 employment training places to give to refugee families. And it has 2 services on the right, which you know, might be school places. Okay? Is the model clear? No notation. I think this is now we just need one constraint here to kind of kick this off, and it's a feasibility constraint. And the feasibility constraint just says the following thing: when you put the refugees into these boxes, make sure that you don't spill out of the number of boxes that you have. So, for example, this would be a feasible allocation. So you can see I've allocated every family, which is good. You might not be able to, it might be impossible, but here we've managed to allocate every family, and we haven't exceeded the capacity that the localities are supplying. So what we're doing in practice at the moment, we actually have this model coded in the software, and it has something like, I think, 10 different dimensions of refugee characteristics that we need to constrain over. And what we do is that we estimate the probability of employment of, say, the yellow family in L3 and the yellow family in L2 and the yellow family in L4, and then we just figure out what is the maximum amount of employment we can possibly get under all of these constraints. So this is an integer program, and it solves and it suggests an allocation to the resettlement agency that would maximize employment. They don't have to do it. It just tells them what they probably should do if the only thing they were interested in is actually maximizing employment. Okay, so that's kind of roughly the idea. And the question we've asked is, you know, can you do better than this? Can you do better than just measuring observable outcomes? What if refugees had preferences over local areas, as of course they do? We don't ask them about their preferences, but they have preferences about where they're being moved. This is probably the most dramatic event, probably a very dramatic positive event usually, but you know, this is a very dramatic event in somebody's life. They're being moved from a country into which they've already fled during a war to another third country. So they would have preferences. It's hard to elicit them, but how would we design a system that would take these preferences into account? And on the other side of the localities, we also don't really ask them about this at the moment, but they have preferences or priorities, if you like, over the kinds of refugees they get, that you can't just express with constraints. So it may be that a local area is really good at helping disabled refugees thrive. And what they really want to do is to take as many disabled refugees as possible. And there are areas like that in the US that are very keen to take the most vulnerable possible refugees. So you can't really express that kind of preference through a constraint. So you need to take that into account in a different way. Okay, so we're doing employment maximization, but how can we push this forward? So here's the results of a very long theory paper, and I can just briefly summarize them for you. So if you're a mechanism designer, I think a lot of these things will sound right. So one of the things that's very easy to do is to say, suppose you only acted on preferences and you looked for a Pareto efficient outcome. You can do this in a way that doesn't give the refugees any incentives to manipulate their preferences, which is pretty cool. So that's easy. Here's something that's impossible. Suppose you said to the refugees, I guarantee that you could be in a particular local area that is, maybe very good for your employment. And what I will not do is I will not allocate you anywhere that is worse than this area, right? I'm going to give you property rights for some reason, right? That's something that came up with our conversations with one of the resettlement agencies. So can you start with some sort of exogenous allocation? Maybe that's the allocation that maximizes employment. And from that allocation, start making improvements in a way that is strategy proof. And the answer is basically no. It seems to be very hard. So to a mechanism designer, that was a kind of an interesting result. So we've got to think about kind of cleverer ways of doing this. So at the moment, we've run into an impossibility result. And of course, the moment you run into an impossibility result, the exciting thing is what is the best possibility result you can get? And so that's the kind of thing that one can work on. So in this world, I don't care about the locality priorities at all. All I care about is the preferences of the refugees. So what happened if we actually tried to mediate the preferences and the priorities of both sides? So in that world, you need a kind of a fairness concept that makes sense for this multidimensional world. And that's something that we define in the paper. So it's a way of saying, a particular family may, how does a family envy another family, right? And so there's a way of doing this that takes multidimensional constraints into account. And actually it turns out that if you want to sort of find a fair mechanism that is really good for the families, that's very easy to do. So if you were just acting on preferences like that, that's easy to do. And in fact, it's also easy to have a sort of a minimally efficient and fair mechanism that will also be strategy proof. And that's also pretty good. But what you can't do is to have all three. So if you've ever done any mechanism design, basically perfect worlds don't exist, and a perfect world really doesn't exist here. So it is actually impossible to have a fair strategy-proof and family optimal mechanism. Okay, so you have a clash. You have this, in this kind of nice new model of matching with multidimensional constraints that we really cooked up just because we were working on this refugee resettlement problem. One sort of led us to the other. You get these drastic trade-offs between fairness, efficiency, and manipulation. And so when we come to apply this with preferences in the future, we need to think very carefully about which one of these things actually matter. Is strategy proofness a very important thing here? Well, we don't know yet because we haven't been collecting preferences of the refugees. They're very hard to access at the moment and so on. But if one were to do this in the future, what are the criteria of a matching system that are going to be important? And so it's good to kind of do the theory first and then worry about this later. At the moment, all we can do is to maximize on an observed outcome. So let me just give you some sort of takeaways. The thing is, to a mechanism designer, I think everything is a mechanism design problem, right? But in particular, refugee resettlement is a mechanism design problem. And that's the thing that I think, the main thing I want to convey is you can think of refugee resettlement, since it's already a centralized process, and there is, in some sense, a designer, you can think of this as a mechanism design problem and thinking about incentives and constraints and feasibility and all the things that we really understand quite well as economists in this context. And we're doing a ton of work, as I've mentioned, which is to try and improve the software. This is really version 0.00, and trying to eventually move towards a world where we can merge preferences of refugees or perhaps priorities of localities somehow in the near future. What's particularly great about working in this space is that the resettlement agencies are really keen to do this better. And so there's, the partner that you work with is just amazingly grateful for the work that you can get done. And so that's amazingly rewarding and really nice. And our partner has been great at this. So if you're a theorist, you probably shouldn't do the things that I put in the possible theoretical extensions, because they're torturously hard, and I only put them in there to mislead you. But well, now you know. But there are kind of cool problems that people are working on that I think actually come entirely from practice. I think most of the interesting questions we've asked in this very small space at the moment, they've all come from actually dealing with practical problems, which is just great. So one of the practical problems that our colleagues in Sweden have is sort of how do you dynamically optimize resettlement over time or over a course of the year. And so our colleagues, Tommy Anderson with his co-authors, have got this entire paper on, it's called Dynamic Refugee Matching, which is trying to figure out what to do in this dynamic context. If you're an empiricist, we don't have enough data, so if you know where I can get more data on refugee outcomes, please come and tell me, and we can do some work together. And the really hard question, I think, if you're an economist, a social psychologist, an anthropologist, is how do you correctly identify refugee preferences? So one thing you probably shouldn't do is to go to a refugee camp and ask people, would you prefer to be relocated in Chicago or in New York? Because that's a pretty useless question. But maybe a more useful question would be to ask people to try to infer their marginal rate of substitution between a very green area and a slightly more criminally ridden area, or something like that. I don't know. So I've been thinking about this for a while, and I know there are some great people who are working on this problem. I don't know how well we're doing on this at the moment, and it would be really nice to apply this in practice. So that's all I have, and this is where the idea for the model came from. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex. So we can take a few questions. If you have any for Alex. Yes, please, Simone.
So I was wondering, in the including the preferences of refugees into the algorithm to maximize employment, I was wondering whether there isn't a problem of one-to-one mapping from preferences to the algorithm, in the sense that, if I think of refugees, many of them, they would prefer to be allocated in places where the employment opportunities are higher. So I wonder whether, this can be part of, your strategy to elicit preferences of many refugees.
So this might well be true, right? So if we told refugees, this is what we think, where you think you would do best, is that true? I just don't have an answer to this question yet, because I don't know what the refugees' preferences are yet, because we've never actually asked them. So I think this is a huge project for the future, so try and elicit this. I think in practice, what's likely to happen is to have a hybrid of two systems where, kind of as I was suggesting, you start out perhaps with an allocation that maximizes employment, and then you say, okay, are there any Pareto improving outcomes of some kind, perhaps, right? And so maybe that's a kind of nice hybrid that you can do. I'm not sure whether a resettlement agency would be happy acting entirely on preferences. That sounds, at least at the moment, I think I would be nervous if I were a resettlement agency. But some hybrid, I think, would make sense. But again, it will really crucially depend on what you're suggesting, which is that correlation.
Any other question? No? So, yeah, there is one. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering whether it matters to try to resettle refugees not as individuals, but as a group coming from the same origin, basically.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So at the moment, this doesn't happen. So at least as far as I know, I don't think there's any country that sort of resettles entire groups of families that they get necessarily bundled together. Families can be quite big in the sense that you can sort of, it's called linking cases. You can link a family to another family, but I think resettling an entire group is quite rare. So this model can handle this, incidentally. So you can bundle as big of a family as you want together. That's completely fine. The only problem with that would be it's very hard. Then you run into this sort of classic social choice problem of how do you aggregate the preferences across many family members. So here, if you can imagine a family with maybe few adults, we can ignore the preferences of the children perhaps, right? And the adults can make it. If there's a lot of adults, how do we aggregate the preferences for a particular family?
Yes?
Regarding soliciting the preferences of the refugees, wouldn't a natural place to start be with sort of classifying locality amenities or disamenities and doing contingent evaluation, sort of like Trudy Cameron did the contingent evaluation paper on environmental issues. So.
Right. And I think that's exactly what I was suggesting. So what we can get for the US is extremely detailed, localized data on amenities, on all sorts of things, including, you know, where the hospital is and where the halal butchery is or whatever it might be. So you get very fine-grained data, and then you can ask people, you know, what matters to them most in their life, and then you can sort of match the area best according to their marginal rate substitution. So I think I'm exactly thinking of this well. But again, remember, the elicitation mechanism has to be simple. You can't ask refugees 400 questions. It has to be quick and informative. So I think the design of that is actually quite hard. But that's a great point.
Okay, I'll ask you maybe the last question, using my privileges as chair. So you presented the kind of the history of matching to refugees literature, and we see that there are different theoretical work that are on display. And then you mentioned that science paper. So the science paper, what it's doing is they're taking data from two countries, from the US and from Switzerland, 20 or 40 years of data with rich information on the characteristics of refugees, rich information on the characteristics, the amenities of the places where they were allocated, and then they just feed the machine. It's a machine learning process, and then the algorithm gives you the best allocation given what we learned from past history when you pick criteria such as employment, okay? And then they show through simulations that if you allocate the last cohort according to the algorithmic solution, then you get, I don't know, a 50% increase in terms of employment performance. So my question is, will theoreticians be replaced by robots in this field?
No.
So I want you to explain us why.
I think two reasons. So to be clear, we actually applied the same process that Hillel's just described, except one of the things that the agency told us to do is they said, can you take all these multidimensional constraints into account? So one of the things that the wonderful science paper didn't do is to sort of think what are these weird constraints, and so they really just made sure that the constraint that is satisfied is the numbers constraint, which is of course the most important constraint. But those little constraints actually do tend to make a difference in practice, and from the data that we have, it does actually make a difference. You can't get quite as big of an employment increase as you would, but I think the theory bit is very straightforward. So what a machine really can't do is to, well, yet, who knows? What a machine can't do yet is to sort of think about mechanisms, social choice rules that have good properties. And so if we think about welfare as something that isn't decided by the designer, but something that we try and get from the refugees or from the local areas and try and satisfy these preferences, we need to think about mechanism design. So unless the machine can prove theorems about impossibility theorems or possibility theorems about properties of social choice rules, I think we still have the edge. I would definitely start worrying when they don't.
We will stay on that optimistic note and move to the second presenter.